The idea that ideology can be and has been commodified, in many cases subverting even revolutionary ideologies, isn't anything new. But if ideology is a commodity, a product, can it be a scam? Does propaganda use the same mechanisms as MLMs? If so, what makes it work? Why do people believe things? More importantly, why do they believe things that are wrong?
I first come across the claim that transgender care is just like lobotomies, bro, when I made that video about Buck Angel. I didn't think much of it at the time because it was just one more insane thing said in that conversation. But now I'm realizing that the lobotomy claim is part of the codified language employed by the transphobic machine. Looking for transgenderism lobotomy or gender affirming lobotomy, when by the way, you'll get dozens upon dozens of opinions, letters, and blogs continuously repeating the mantra that, in fact, they are like lobotomies. Bro, I made fun of the fact that Angel couldn't offer any sort of explanation as to how and why they're similar, even though it was clear that he had wanted to do so.
So why aren't we doing lobotomies anymore? People get so mad at me in the community. Well, Buck, they're two different. They are not two different things at all. They are very similar because they figure. So yeah, the kid thing is distressing for me.
At the time, I didn't realize that this fact already pointed towards the truth of the matter. It is a belief created by repetition within a selected group, and because its truth is so obvious to the people in that group, it doesn't require any explanation. Falsehoods like that are not uncommon. One of the most rampant examples is people believing that in the Middle Ages, nobody bathed and people thought the world was flat. What is unusual about the lobotomy thing is its political dimension. Any old person who doesn't happen to be a historian may believe these things about the Middle Ages, but in the other case, a political target audience, a target demographic, is constructed by creating an illusionary truth through money and activism, and also selecting people out who don't fall in line. The claim about the lobotomies is very outlandish, and a discussion about lobotomy has kind of ended. As a society, we've moved past it. So you also construct very special language to construct this target demographic. The repetition not only solidifies the audience, but also increases its potential size with every repetition. Because every repetition makes us more likely to believe that it's true. If you've heard something before, you become less and less likely to question it. Linguistic priming is the most important aspect of a scam. I watched a lot of Coffee's a Lost content
in 2022,
and I came across an interview he did with a man named Garrett, which I found particularly insightful. In that interview, Garrett spends a lot of time explaining how language facilitated him believing something that wasn't true. The mentioned illusionary truth effect plays a key role in this, as frequent repetition or other aspects that ease information processing, like familiarity, have an incredible effect on our likelihood to believe something. Garrett also mentions a made up phrase, the high income skill, which drew him into the sales funnel. Having this imaginary thing was supposedly the only prerequisite to riches, but also completely necessary. You will become rich if and only if you have the high income skill. As such, if riches is what you desired, you must attend these expensive seminars and buy the books to acquire that skill. With the familiar you gotta buy now urgency, a potent mix was created to make the audience fearful of not participating. Doubts were silenced through two routes. To prime the newcomers, they were made to feel that they're destined for greatness. And overconfidence often makes people immune to corrections. But this feeling good about yourself is highly conditional. You only get to enjoy it when you follow the leader. If you succeed, it is thanks to us, but if you fail, it's all your personal fault. Scammees weren't explicitly given guarantees for jobs or success, but according to Garrett, they pretty much said anything but that. So they would come to that conclusion by themselves, while the scammers could uphold plausible deniability and, as such, no liability.
Pretty much
He makes
said
the
it.
implication, you're going to get a
Yes.
job, you're going to get a job, you're going to get a job.
And that's what gets me is that so much of this shit he can throw it back on you and be like, oh, I never said that. But it's like, dude, you pretty much said everything but that. Like, you molded us to do this. So
when the leader said that some members weren't pulling their weight, other members would flame them in the comments. Those that spoke up were jumped on by other members, which is especially hurtful when it's coming from your in-group. When Garrett's family told him that this was some cult shit, he had fights with them and attributed their opposition to their lower mindset. We're not like you, stuck in the matrix. We actually know reality. He concludes, all of this mindset shit wasn't to make you a better person, but to suck you in. I think the general pillars of this priming, or grooming, as Garrett happened to call it, can be summed up with three things. 1. A simplification of the world that allows them, and them alone, to provide answers for. 2. Invoke overconfidence in your target group, in themselves as epistemic subjects and agents, as well as what you're selling them. And 3. Constantly reinforcing the belief system and pushing the target group further and further, while omitting both what you're pushing them to do as well as what you're actually selling them. Achieved is this through the exploitation of some flaws that we all have, falling for illusionary truth, confirmation bias, and a need to belong that makes us internalize criticism from our in-group and reject a lot of criticism from our out-group.
And when you see these master classes, you're thinking that these guys are going to be holding your hand with you every step of the way, mentoring you one-on-one, like you're something special. You're just a herd of sheep. They're just guiding you. So, say what you want. A lot of people can be like, dude, well, that's your fault for quitting your job. But hey, I'm one of hundreds, if not thousands of people in that program who did the same thing. Everyone I knew quit their jobs.
It's like, how did I get myself scammed? And it's because it's an orchestrated thing. He uses your psychology against you. I mean,
exactly. And hey, that shit, like, hey, once you go against the family, you're never allowed back in. And yeah, that shit plays on your mind.
Since these flaws are present in all of us, similar dynamics can, in my eyes, pop up in any group. The key difference is the willful exploitation by reinforcing behaviors that isolate and alienate the people from anyone but that particular in-group. And by willful, I don't necessarily mean knowingly. Garrett said in that interview, he doesn't think that the guru himself is aware of what he's doing. He thinks that he just had too much of his own Kool-Aid. People who were lucky enough to have never been targeted like this tend to really underestimate the effects mentioned here. It's usually explained away with the one-off phrase that these people were vulnerable. But vulnerable how compared to others? Scamming someone who is financially destitute isn't exactly a profitable scheme, is it? Well, I was writing the original draft for all this a long time ago, I was bombarded with VPN ad reads back to back. It was like every 30 minutes or so, I had to sit through another one. I was told the same thing over and over again by different people. Use our VPN service to enhance privacy and security. And even though I knew these claims aren't really true, the repetition still made me insecure enough to go check again. Then, if you look something up, You need to be very diligent in finding a source that doesn't stand to profit from selling you the thing, which becomes harder every damn day thanks to the enshittification of search engines. And the only reason I even did look it up was because I had already learned previously that these claims aren't really true. We want to believe people. We are wired to do so. If somebody tells you that there's a gunman in the mall, you have to be pretty insane to just discount that and ask the person how could they possibly know that and what their evidence is. When it comes to transphobia, we obviously have the repetition, which is also why I personally think debunking isn't really helping, but could potentially make the problem even worse. But the urgency and excess confidence is also present. The urgency comes from the fact that we're talking about children and lobotomizing them, for Christ's sake. That is a pretty urgent issue if it were true. And the excess confidence is certainly fostered by individuals within the group interacting with one another, but also lies in the phrase alone. We are seeing what is actually happening. We are protecting children. We are right and have to stop this unimaginable cruelty. Watching all that content, I started to feel like that there's generally a tendency to describe MLMs and other scams, like the one I described earlier, with terms from cult research. Survivor or love bombing being two of them. In kind of lefty adjacent political spheres, the same is often extended to conspiracy theorists, TERFs, conservatives in general, really. In fact, that was kind of the angle that I approached this from too. In his video from the 2nd of April, Big Joel mentioned cult hopping in his section about JP moving to conservatism, while also saying, I'm not saying he's in a cult. Well, then why do we use cult analogies? Especially considering that the people we accuse tend to say the exact same thing about us. Well, I think the main thing and the key difference between the accusation from one side and from the other is that one group of people is verifiably wrong, gets strongly convinced and immune to corrections. I think the codified language actually seems to serve to eradicate a deeper meaning of a proposition. It eradicates belief. An often undiscussed facet of covert conspiracies is that many already conspiracy-brained people seem to be absolutely terrified of the virus before governments took any measures against it. A lot of them claim that the virus is actually a highly lethal bioweapon for the Great Reset, or whatever. And yet, a few months later, they believe the exact opposite, that it's fake and the fear-mongering will be used for the Great Reset, or whatever. In the conspiratorial mind, there is no contradiction here, because they don't actually believe any proposition. They mimic belief to express what they're truly convinced of, going against the mainstream. That is the one thing they care for, and they'll say whatever fulfills that. That's also why absolutely nobody bats an eye when conservatives move on from the critical race theory, like that culture scare never happened or never mattered. Back on track though, what is the goal of deploying these tactics to foster transphobia? Very few people actually give a shit about trans people, one way or another, because it's just not relevant to their lives. Whether trans people exist, whether they get the healthcare that they need, what does it matter in the grand scheme of things? I mean.
Now we are told that the great debate is about who gets to use which bathroom. This is a distraction from our real problems. Who cares?
Did I just agree with Peter Thiel? The scam turns it from this non-issue into the issue for the exact reason that it's actually no issue at all. Trans people can't fight back that well because there's fewer of them and they have no institutional power. Legislation against them is cheap because you don't actually need to do anything. You don't have to think about financing or think about what needs to be put in place to achieve your goals. Because let's say your goal is to increase child welfare. First, you'd have to figure out what material means could possibly achieve that. One such way would be to alleviate child poverty. We know poverty has detrimental effects on well-being overall, and roughly 16% of children in the US live in poverty. Gathering and evaluating data already takes effort. Then, you gotta think about what actual policies to put in place to alleviate said poverty. Again, gathering and evaluating data, maybe try a thing here and there. Then, you actually have to conceptualize and write a bill to put these measures in place and take the huge risk that A, the bill isn't going to get through the legislative body, or B, if it does, it doesn't have the desired effects, both of which tend to be seen as blemishes on one's career. Why do all that when you can just push a third of a bill out that A, only has an effect on a stark minority of the population, B, has no scientific or data-backed reason for existing, C, virtually doesn't cost anything to implement money-wise, and D, you can just pretend it's saving children because your audience has already been groomed into believing that it will. It creates an illusion. The illusion that the legislator is doing something really important and grand when it basically doesn't cost them anything at all. Once they kept that dirt cheap promise, they can use that success to promote their re-election, even though they've done as little as anyone else. It's kind of like me saying, if you elect me or if you subscribe to my channel, I'm going to give you the dirt of my kitchen floor. The dirt on my kitchen floor has no value to me aside from being sustenance for hard times. So fulfilling that promise doesn't cost me anything resource or effort wise. And once I've given you that worthless dirt that you've been primed into believing is actually the most important thing, you're not unlikely to think, wow, this guy is great. He actually keeps his promises. Partaking in the peddling of this empty product requires either superhuman levels of cynicism where nothing you say actually matters, incredible amounts of new logic that somehow connects ruining trans people's lives to saving the country from the cabal, or ridiculous and childish amounts of hatred and disdain for anything that doesn't reflect you. The imbalance that it supposedly has no effect on cis people, while life-destroying for trans people, is also what makes it nothing but a tool for oppression. And the propaganda machine is the means to achieve that. I've largely ignored group dynamics up to this point because it's a complex topic, and at the moment I'm honestly not that interested in it. If you do want to watch me bumble through that topic, you can watch my video about cancel culture and moral panics. However, when it comes to facilitation of extremism and violence, Hannah Arendt actually made an important observation. In her article, Authority in the 20th Century, which I happened to stumble across because of cult research, Arendt pointed out,
"The proper image of totalitarian rule and organization seems to me to be the structure of the onion. The great advantage of this system is that the movement provides for each of its layers the fiction of a normal world, along with consciousness of being different from and more radical than it. Thus, the sympathizers of the front organizations, whose convictions differ only in intensity from those of the party membership, surround the whole movement and provide a deceptive facade of normality to the outside world, because of their lack of fanaticism and extremism. while at the same time they represent the normal world to the totalitarian movement, whose members come to believe that their convictions differ only in degree from those of other people, so that they never need be aware of the abyss which separates their own world from that which actually surrounds it.
In other words, the outermost layer are kind of tuned down versions of extremists. They believe the same thing, but they may not endorse extremist practices like murder, for example. They make people outside of the onion believe that the whole movement isn't so bad or has some points, like a normal political organization. They also facilitate this normality towards the extremists, however, which allows them to think that their position isn't extreme at all. Thus, all the layers kind of dupe one another without necessarily being aware of that, particularly when it comes to massively funded conservative political organizations pushing their anti-trans rhetoric. It's hard to grasp and articulate how these dynamics develop and function without invoking some kind of shadowy puppeteer. And yes, I am going to make that disclaimer again. These dynamics are elusive, and our language often falls short to accurately describe them. On top of that, the dynamic of a situation can make you or other people act in a way that is just completely bewildering and ununderstandable once you're removed from that situation. But the invocation of a puppeteer is in of itself a massive oversimplification of the world, and I want to stress that I neither think that they exist, nor do I want anyone else to think that. Complicated situations are the result of long chains of events and thousands of small moving parts, so to speak, often without intent or even awareness of the end result. These right-wing organizations are not overflowing with super geniuses who have a concrete plan how to manipulate the masses. They are throwing shit at the wall and see what sticks. The baseline isn't any more complex than YouTubers cycling through James Charles to Colleen Benninger to Illuminati to James Somerton to Mama Max, and the obvious incentives to engage in these hot topics. The kind of transphobia we've been seeing the past few months, and by now, unfortunately, years, is fundamentally unserious. It is resistant to evidence and correction, and as such exists far beyond what we usually call reality. Overt concerns about health, fairness, or safety are at best fallacies and at worst manipulative. The truth is that people are transphobic because there are certain groups of people and institutions that have an interest in them being transphobic. And these so-called concerns serve as nothing but ex post rationalizations for irrational beliefs. This can be best observed in the anti-trans bills in the United States, now numbering over 500. While I haven't looked at all of those bills, by my assessment, the majority of them are either concerned with the use of puberty blockers or trans people in sports. So let's talk about both of them. The use of puberty blockers has been banned in some US states or called into serious question, like in the UK. Of course, the majority of people who are put on puberty blockers aren't actually trans, but have an extraordinary early onset of puberty. And while that likely isn't physically unhealthy, it is generally assumed that it can cause social and, as a result, psychological issues. This doubt, or even criminalization in some instances, brings serious scrutiny to a doctor's decision and judgment, which will likely make them more hesitant about prescribing that medication. Withholding medication from non-trans people who would benefit from the treatment. Even though these bills only criminalize the use of those puberty blockers on people who have gender dysphoria, we've seen similar things in the area of palliative care, where a strict ban on assisted suicide brought about major scrutiny to doctors who prescribed and used, for example, a lot of
morphine.
And as a result have been charged with manslaughter. Now you may think that such scrutiny towards doctors is warranted. They should be held to the highest ethical standard. But this scrutiny relies on the fact that the medication in question is, in fact, dangerous to health and life of the patient. The basis on which puberty blockers are banned or restricted is that there are no or very few studies about their effects in the long term. The UK Department of Health and Social Care found that the quality of evidence was of very low certainty for puberty blocker outcomes regarding mental health, quality of life, and impact on gender dysphoria. And the quality of evidence for using puberty blockers to treat children struggling with their gender identity was very low, and that existing studies on puberty blockers were small and subject to bias and confounding. There are studies showing very positive effects for trans youth, Tordov et al. And Ru et al., and one study about a trans man who had taken puberty blockers then went on HRT and was monitored for 22 years with no observable negative effects for him. But, quote, the evidence is lacking. And yes, it is. Because definitively proving that it is an effective treatment for youths who show symptoms of gender dysphoria with no negative effects in the long term would mean putting perfectly healthy people on puberty blockers as a control group and then monitoring them until their deaths, essentially. As a liberal arts pleb, I'm just gonna go ahead and say these conclusions are a fair evaluation of the state of knowledge on the matter. I'm not equipped to or interested in proving the contrary. But what matters here is what lawmakers take from these scientific conclusions and how fucking far they run with them. Let me read you a little excerpt of a bill in Ohio to show how these scientific conclusions might and are used to bolster, well, discrimination. Scientific studies show that individuals struggling with distress at identifying with their biological sex often have experienced psychopathology, which indicates these individuals should be encouraged to seek mental health care services before undertaking any hormonal or surgical intervention. You may think to yourself, well, that's fair, isn't it? But the problem is, they already are. All the guidelines I'm aware of require a mental health professional in the evaluation of a trans person who is a minor. Every single one. Even disregarding the fact that they have written an alternative reality where that doesn't happen into law. Alternatives should be encouraged is one of the weirdest justifications for a law that I've ever seen, at least. In that it's actually no justification at all. It's kind of nonsense. Another quote, healthcare providers are also prescribing cross-sex hormones for children who experience distress at identifying with their biological sex, despite the fact that no randomized clinical trials have been conducted on the efficacy or safety of the use of cross-sex hormones in adults or children for the purpose of treating such distress of gender transition.
Okay, so just pretend like my lips are matching up to the video, because I didn't make my point here very well. A randomized clinical trial can mean a couple of things, but the baseline is that you have one group which receives intervention and one group who does not or receives different kind of care. Initially, I thought this to mean they are suggesting a blinded clinical trial, which to me seems to be kind of moot, because you're generally not blind towards the fact whether you are receiving cross-sex HRT or not. However, it's also possible that what they're asking for is just, that the people who get treatment and the people who don't get treatment are randomized, which seems kind of odd to me, since our current standard of knowledge is that these medications are actually helpful. You're also withholding medication from people who want it and will most likely benefit from it, since there has been observed that there's more suicidality among trans people who do not get HRT even though they want it. That's a very big ethical concern as well. Then there's also the problem of what are you actually measuring? That the fact that the medication is useful or effective is established. We don't need clinical trials to see whether testosterone works. We know it does. So what would be observed, what would be tested is whether people actually feel better with it or not. And in that case, I don't really understand what a randomized clinical trial would change at all. Because trans people say they feel better with it. We have surveys establishing that they do. We have anecdotes establishing that they do. So what's the point of the randomized clinical trial? Like, what are we trying to establish that would necessitate a randomized clinical trial? Yeah, I don't know. Whatever. Get back to the video. I didn't study natural sciences. Please don't laugh.
All the evidence we do have point towards what they're asking for. So they're asking for more evidence, better evidence, evidence that is impossible to produce. And the backdrop of this argumentative strategy are now decades worth of big corporations undermining the scientific consensus and, as such, the prospect of scientific knowledge. A bit of a curveball, but let me explain. It is precisely what the tobacco industry, the climate change denial industry, and most likely the sugar industry have used and still use. The US Tobacco Institute's public strategy was to, quote, create doubt about the health charge without actually denying it, and encouraging objective scientific research as the only way to resolve the question of health hazard. As Brand puts it, the goal would be to build and broadcast a major scientific controversy. The public must get the message that the issue of the health effects of smoking remains an open question when it wasn't. Doubt, uncertainty, and the truism that there's more to know would become the industry's collective mantra. So long as this uncertainty could be maintained, so long as the industry could claim not proven, it would be positioned to fight any attempt to assert regulatory authority over the industry. These industries don't deny studies that contradict their goals, but rather question their conclusiveness or significance. It weaponizes the inherent skepticism and uncertainty of the scientific endeavor to actually undermine the prospect of scientific knowledge. In my opinion, one way they do this is to set the bar of conclusive proof so high that it can't possibly be met. For tobacco, for example, it would have meant making a significant group of people smoke for, 50 years with a control group that wouldn't, which would be a highly unethical practice if there's even a sliver of a possibility that this will cause them to suffer fatal diseases. And for climate change, it would mean having an exact, identical copy of our planet in vitro or something to observe whether global warming or climate change would happen without burning fossil fuels. It's impossible. Now, I don't think that the scientists who worked on the mentioned reviews on the use of puberty blockers are willingly taking part in this political deception. I think they are reasonably skeptic, and I think their conclusions are probably sound. There is no conclusive evidence whether these medications are absolutely reversible, absolutely safe, or absolutely helpful. The question is, does there need to be? There's even less evidence that they're actually harmful. As far as I know, there's none. The previously mentioned Todorov et al. Found that gender-affirming care with medication in use was associated with 60% lower odds of moderate or severe depression and 73% lower odds of suicidality over a 12-month follow-up. Since we can't do the gold standard of randomized clinical trials for either puberty blockers or HRT, at least in my opinion, again, no natural scientist here, the other option would be to compare the results with the standard of care for related illnesses. And if we assume the framework that opponents of this treatment are coming from, that gender dysphoria is just a mental illness or a kind of mental illness, that would be what HRT would be compared to. Most likely antidepressants, SSRI, because, and this might be a tough pill to swallow, trans people generally have a grasp on reality. They just feel like shit. Well, antidepressants are about 20 to 30% more effective than placebo, and we have absolutely no problem giving them to minors if advised, even though there is evidence that they are associated with an increased risk of heart disease, stroke, and fractures in long-term usage. Not to mention SSRI-induced sexual dysfunction, which is so common that I feel even silly mentioning it. In adults, it's about 50 to 60% of all people who take SSRIs, and in youths, we don't really know, probably around the same rate. In my opinion, everything that people are supposedly concerned about can provably be found in the alternative center of care, which isn't really an alternative because no amount of antidepressants will make gender dysphoria go away. And of course, these studies are of limited comparability. A blinded study isn't the same as simply reporting a decrease of depression rates, because that can also happen with placebo, and they have massively different sample sizes. What I'm trying to show here is that real doubt and uncertainty are massively overblown for one type of medication and not for the other in the public discourse. And to me, this can only be explained with political reasons. That's not the scientist's fault or the fault of concerned doctors. But it absolutely is the fault of politicians and the media. The problem here is not asking for more research. It's banning access to potentially life-saving medication and procedures while having no evidence that the potential risks outweigh its benefits. Antidepressants weren't banned even when it became apparent that they increased the risk of self-harm, especially in youth. They just got a warning label. It's an ideological scam. Things are claimed that are provably untrue, things are obscured that can be proven to be false, and instead of them providing evidence for their claims, we have to give them evidence that their assertions are wrong. All of it made possible by the decades of strategic weaponization of the scientific credo for corporate gain. You know something's wrong when two opposing sides equally claim that their views are informed by science. And by the way, my favorite part of the Alabama bill is that they explicitly exempt infant genital surgery on intersex people. They really managed to make sure it couldn't even by accident have a positive effect. Amidst all of this, let's not forget that we've been here before. While the legislation is targeted towards trans and or intersex people, it inevitably affects everyone because there is no clear, distinct line when someone is trans or inter, their assigned sex or not. Are women with Maya syndrome inter? Who knows? But keeping this collateral damage under a closed lid and pretend as if we haven't seen it before festers the illusion for members of the dominant class or group that this is a policing that will not affect them, until they or their daughters will be forced to thoroughly and continually be examined to prove that they fulfill the criteria of standardized femininity and then withheld an opportunity because, sorry, the titty is too small. Sex testing in the Olympics had already been requested by the US Olympics Committee head in the 30s because Mark Weston and Zdeněk Kubik had repeatedly won women's titles and set records. They were assigned female at birth, turned out to be intersex, and transitioned, for lack of a better word, after their sports careers in 35 and 36. Quote, the dramatic successes of female athletes from the USSR and GDR in the middle decades of the 20th century certainly caused the sports organizations of the West some concern. That some of these women had physiques which transgressed traditional Western notions of femininity was obvious. So systematic, at events standardized, quote, scientific, unquote, sex tests were introduced in the 1960s because the process of femininity certification by team and family doctors that already existed could no longer be trusted. Brundage is noted to have been an extreme anti-communist, which I think is fair to say might have had something to do with all this. It just couldn't be true that these athletes were winning fair and square because USA. In the 90s, testing was abolished. Why is that? These tests were deeply unpopular with many athletes, who saw them as invasive and often functionless or unfair. As the American shot putter Maren Sidler said of the test in Winnipeg, They lined us up outside a room where there were 3 doctors sitting in a row behind desks. You had to go in and pull up your shirt and push down your pants. Then they just looked while you waited for them to confer and decide if you were okay. While I was in line, I remember one of the sprinters, a tiny skinny girl, came out shaking her head back and forth saying, "Well, I failed. I didn't have enough up top. They say I can't run and I have to go home because I'm not big enough." Not only were the tests perceived as crude and unpleasant, they were also not sufficient in and of themselves. In the mid-1980s, the high-profile case of Spanish hurdler Maria Martinez Patino, who fought a 3-year campaign for reinstatement after being disqualified, was used to pressure the IOC and other organizations into changing or eliminating their sex tests. Patino failed a bar body test at the World University Games held in Kobe, Japan in 1985. Patino eventually succeeded in overturning the ruling based on the principle that a specific medical condition, androgen insensitivity syndrome, meant that she failed a bar body test while gaining no physiological spotting advantage. So the argument was not that testing for sex was problematic in of itself, but rather that this specific test, using chromosomes as a proxy for spotting ability, was inappropriate. And as Time magazine noted in 1936, to sober medical men, it does not seem strange that nature sometimes blurs sexual development in men and women. Biologists say there is no such thing as absolute sex. Anatomists recognize a consistent parallelism between the genital structures of male and female. Recent research on female sex hormones reveals that the corresponding male hormones are chemically almost identical. Normal men generate traces of female hormones and vice versa. Thus, being male or female is not a matter of one element completely excluding the other, but rather of one element dominating the other. I thought it bad enough that I assumed the debate to go back to the 70s, but learning that it's been going on since the 20s and 30s doom pills me like nothing else. At the end of the paper I quoted, the author, Heggie, poses the following question. When exactly did concerns that exercise might virilize women turn into a fear that being virile and being a woman was cheating? We generally assume it to be self-evident that masculinized women participating against other women to be cheating, which is how the question why it should constitute cheating is rarely, if ever, asked. Now, for trans people like me who are on HRT and have our hormones more rigorously screened and tweaked than any other population group on the planet, Olympic rules like that aren't really a problem. But the same cannot be said for intersex people or women who just have high T levels for one reason or another. Now, if you look at the highest performing athletes in any discipline, you'll notice they're anything but average, because of course they are. Some say that Simone Biles at this point only competes against herself, and it's been speculated that she just has an unparalleled, amazing sense of internal balance. Michael Phelps, probably the best contemporary swimmer in the world, has some hand and feet which arguably make him a fish. Is that cheating? Even not looking at specific individuals within specific disciplines, if you compare body types across disciplines, you'll see that they hugely vary. Gymnasts are usually relatively short, swimmers are usually quite tall, and arguably not fitting well into these types, you'll not even be able to qualify for something like the Olympics. Because it is these minor things that give you an edge competing on the highest level. Even if I'd be in peak physical condition, which I'm not, I'd never be a basketball or volleyball player because I'm just too fucking short. Am I being cheated? Is an autistic librarian cheating? If not, why is the likewise rarity of a woman with naturally higher T levels considered not just having an edge, but cheating? If we think of transphobia as a product, this allows us to not only look at how the product is sold, but also what makes the product so appealing, marketable in the first place. Of course, there's the usual trans people are criminals, think of the children, the fabric of society is being destroyed. These aspects are also all part of racism, homophobia, and sexism. While the acceptance of gay people seems to have suffered in lieu of the aggressive push of transphobia, it's hard to say whether that truly is because they intermingle in this nexus of otherness and oppression, or they're just being marketed in conjunction. Organizations that drive these attitudes and policies usually aren't just homophobic or aren't just transphobic, they're also racist and misogynist. Basically, I do believe it's possible to be racist without being homophobic or transphobic without being sexist, even though their mechanisms and social functions are similar and often linked to one another. The following section will be based on the presumption that transphobia has unique aspects that make it distinguishable from other forms of oppression, not only by who and what they target, but how they do it as well. What is it that distinguishes transphobia from homophobia, racism, sexism? When it comes to racism and sexism, one can quite conveniently point towards the profit orientation of our capitalist societies. It is profitable to have a quasi-slave class. It is profitable to underpay care work. But what about queerphobia? The driving force in that case seems to be less the capitalist structure and rather everything else. What I do want to talk about is what makes transphobia so successful. Specifically, so successful as a product. In order for a product to really succeed, it has to be there at the right time in order to tap into a certain emotion. Devices with touchscreens, for example, are a lot older than the iPhone, but it still was kind of the iPhone that spread its application throughout the world. In the same time that the amount of people who report that they know a trans person has increased by 9%, the amount of people who say that changing one's gender is morally wrong has also increased by 4%. That goes counter to everything we thought. Usually it is stipulated that contact to the minority significantly reduces things such as racism or racial bias. And I think what trans people, especially those that medically transition, can evoke is a type of body horror. Abnormal sex, grotesque, bizarre eroticism, and bodily transformations are all essential parts to that genre. Zombies typically lose their individuality through their bodily transformation. Gregor Samsa lies in his bed fully aware, but, well, a bug. And if you look at the creature design of the 1979 Alien, they are all weirdly sexual, with parts reminiscent of human features, the ones, and they use humans to reproduce against their will. In all of these cases, the transformation is seen as so distressing because they are involuntary by the human participants, and ultimately strips them not only of who they are, but what they are. I think the cis lens on trans people encompasses a feeling or notions similar to that, which is tapped into by the propaganda. That is why, when it comes to trans people, we are bombarded by claims of bodily harm and damage and a supposed compulsion to undergo that supposed damage. Which actually brings me back to the question of athletes outside of the sex binary. To my own surprise, the underlying fear here seems to be that it will pressure cis people to undergo procedures they do not want to approximate getting a certain edge. Because unlike changing the height of your body or the size of its parts, with HRT, that's something that can be done with relative ease. In this framework, gender-affirming care is not seen as a medical intervention that saves, or at the very least, improves people's lives, but as a corporation-peddled enhancement that people don't want, but feel like they have to get. And if they don't get it, they will lose out. Now, I personally don't need bottom surgery, I don't think. So when a friend of mine tells me of his, I do get this kind of, damn. And I suspect the reason for that is because I happen to see that specific procedure through a cis lens. And that's ultimately kind of how cis people in general see gender-affirming care, particularly the surgical kind. It is uncomfortable, kind of unnerving, just the real difference between a transphobic person and someone who isn't wrong is how that specific feeling is being handled. Of course, it's kind of uncomfortable and unnerving. It's surgery. People have the same reaction when I tell them about my epiectomy. When I tell them they drilled a hole into my skull, into my jaw, went in with fucking drills and shit, cut a cyst out, and then sewed the whole thing shut with steel wires. I mean, it's not a pleasant thing to imagine, to think about. Some people call it empathy, some call it mirror neurons. The key difference is that no one would even dream of saying, well, maybe you shouldn't have gotten an epiectomy. Maybe you should have just let that shit rot, become septic, and fucking die. Maybe that's the better option. Even when it comes to elective procedures, which I don't consider gender-affirming care to be, people may question or criticize it, sure, but have you ever heard someone saying, cutting open a chest and putting a silicone-filled balloon inside should be fucking illegal? Because while breast augmentations, reductions, or removals are part of our everyday lives, for better and for worse, the framing is very different. Procedures that trans and cis people undergo are not framed and understood as fundamentally the same thing. Under this framework, Joe Rogan giving himself a roid god is, at worst, a stupid decision on his part, while a trans man supplementing testosterone within a healthy range and supervised by doctors is this profound perversion. Same with the double mastectomy that Angelina Jolie had gotten performed with no immediate medical necessity. And this different framing is grounded in the idea, in the understanding that it is a sex change in the case of trans people. Something that changes the ontological fabric of a person in an essential way. Without going into too much detail about the conversations I have with friends, I did see bottom surgery as a primary sexual thing, because what else are you gonna do with a ding dong? And I mean, yeah, that's probably part of it, but it's not really the main thing. It's never the reason or the motivation, because the motivation or the reason is to feel correctly situated in your body, to fix the sense of embodiment that isn't correctly aligned, to fix the sensation that your body is alien. Because ironically, the body horror that is imagined to the cis person is very real to the trans person. It's what the experience of gender dysphoria is all about. And even though I knew that from personal experience, I still fell into that fallacy, that trap. And it's very easy for that to happen if it concerns something that you're not feeling yourself. Cis people can only see trans people and gender-affirming care through this sexual lens because they are typically blind to the sensation of being in a body. Because nothing is wrong. It's similar to how we register touching a table or sitting on a bed. We don't usually consciously register it at all. Rather, we tend to register all of the other things we're doing in the meantime, like eating food, watching a show, or making a stupid video. We don't consciously feel and register our limbs or teeth unless we're in pain. Having no toothache makes you functionally blind to the sensation of having teeth, just as we are usually blind to our breathing, heartbeat, bowel movements, and so on. Having no bodily issue means not consciously feeling your body. And because cis people do not have the same issue with their bodies, feeling alien in them, they are blind to the sensation of being embodied and the issues that gender-affirming care seeks to address. It's like trying to explain a toothache to someone who has never felt pain in their life. The other part that makes this successful is that I think we all feel a certain level of unfreedom and coercion within our societies. Politically and socially, personal matters and choices that may serve as disadvantages in this forced upon competition between workers tend to be used as rationalizations for suffering. If you pursue an arts degree, you aren't entitled to complain about poverty or talk about the suffering under poverty. If you wear a hijab or look like this, you only have yourself to blame for the discrimination you experience. It is this covert social coercion that I think especially TERFs seem to fear when it comes to trans people. Gender-affirming care isn't standard medical care to them, it's a voluntary upgrade from womanhood in the case of trans men. And they seem to think that this possibility destroys the reason for women's struggles for liberation. Because if you can just become a man, what do we need emancipation for? If you can just get a camera interface installed into your brain to fix blindness, we need not respect or value anyone who chooses not to, which I think is not only a fundamentally silly and immoral vision for society, but also completely undermines the feminist slogan, "My body, my choice." But okay. To justify this implicit attitude, they utilize body horror and sexism, parading young AFAB people around that took testosterone in a transphobic circus that seeks to convince the audience that somehow the female body is debased by such an action, by virilizing HRT. This weaponizes current beauty standards of the female body, since the audience is supposed to be innately horrified and offended by the mere sight of a bearded female body or a bald female body. Ironically, cementing that being a bearded woman or a bald woman means being lesser. The idea that it's still somehow an upgrade if you can manage to live as a man also ties into the language that is being deployed. People who are diagnosed but don't transition or detransition are desisters. And granted, I'm not sure how that word is used in regular society outside of legal papers, but it seems like an odd choice of words to me. I also think it is intentional that it is similar to resistance or resisting. What it really seems to connotate in this context is that these people resist the temptation of being or becoming trans, declaring their past wrongness, and now vow to follow the real truth that the righteous, using that word, knew all along. Of course, these attitudes are just as present in even more right-leaning transphobes who wouldn't consider themselves feminists. Bodies are the property of society, so use of it that does not serve it is just not acceptable. Usually, of course, they don't mean society in any material way, but an abstraction of a society, like a nation, whether it's abortion, staying unmarried, or transitioning. When they speak of something like parents' rights, what they really mean is the right of an elitist collective to control individuals, the right of a metaphysical father that rightfully demands obedience to his vision. My main point here, however, is that I believe that a lot of these attitudes are just as present in people who aren't transphobic or, just indifferent to trans people. Hell, to a degree, even in me. The key factor in these cases is whether or not one allows one's biases and impulses to be weaponized against innocent people, If you believe trans men aren't real men and are never going to be real men, I honestly don't really care. What matters here isn't what you think, it's what you're doing. You can believe that trans people are all pumpkin-obsessed freaks and still stand against stripping them of their rights. These are not mutually exclusive, nor is it hypocritical to believe someone is crazy and still see them as people who are entitled to their rights. To the contrary, that is what makes us moral agents. We all have our biases and instincts, and even if they're not factually based or even wrong, having them doesn't make you a bad person or makes the thinking itself immoral. What makes someone morally wrong is to not recognize that, to not realize that negative feelings do not justify unjust actions. But herein also kind of lies the problem. The most heinous crimes in history weren't committed and couldn't have been committed by an individual. They were at least minimally coordinated by a group. And yes, it is true that not every individual of that society or collective actively partook in them. But there was indifference, a sufficient amount of indifference among the majority. And I think that is what propaganda ultimately really seeks to achieve. Yes, it can and does radicalize, but radicals have always been a minority that was carried and enabled by an indifferent majority. Sane people do not care about HRT, what other people do with their bodies. But that they do not care is part of the threat. Unfortunately, I can't exactly blame anyone for not caring either. Nobody can care about everything. I don't care about everything either. If I wouldn't be trans myself, I'm not sure whether I would care about this shit or not. So, while I do think that debunking is ultimately a pointless exercise, it does play a role in showing what these people are actually doing. That they're not just overshooting in their supposed attempt to fix problems, but that the problem they're attempting to fix is civil rights. Their problem is that their subjects aren't obedient enough reflections of what they want to see. Their problem is that people who aren't them are free. Transphobia is both extremely niche and universal. I neither think that there needs to be public debates about which bathroom someone uses, nor that there should be. But these extremely niche issues are universalized through appeals to general emotions in cis people, conflating what the underlying problem is for trans people and what the potential problem could be for a cis person. This is done by obfuscating that it's actually no general problem at all. Not only is it a lie that the average cis person will begin to ponder whether they really are a man or a woman when they are confronted with the challenge of going to the bathroom, but it also presents the problem of trans people as ontological problems when they are not. What trans people need to have addressed and want to have addressed are their practical problems, because that's what politics is for. Their question isn't whether they really are man or woman, their question is what they can do in order to not get assaulted. It denies trans people political agency by turning transphobia into a universally consumable product, something to be philosophically debated, instead of a socio-political structure that denies them access to the means to fulfill their needs. Trans people's lives become public spectacles and the foundation to discuss philosophical questions and problems, like thought experiment labs, when they are actually real physical people with genuine experiences. If trans people's experiences would be seen as genuine, and they themselves as actual people with material needs, their lives would not become these thought experiment labs in which cis people can test out their own mental faculties. As fun as it is to discuss Thompson's violinist or one of the bajillion trolley problems, if in this very moment there is a real person tied to real tracks, having that discussion becomes irrational really fucking fast. And to counter the moral, practical problem of a person is currently tied to the tracks with the ontological question what a person even is ludicrous. If there is such a thing, such as philosophical malpractice, this is it. It is the creation of these thought experiment labs, which political transphobia aims at, in order to obfuscate not only trans people's material problems, but everyone's. It's targeted at cis people, the buyer, turning trans people into a distraction, just one of the many sacrificial lambs necessary so that the powerful can pretend like they're not just riding out the collapse that they're causing, while also normalizing government and bourgeoisie overreach into our private medical decisions, extending control over each individual in society. Transphobia is a scam, whether it's high-level tax evasion or anti-civil rights activism. It's all just another drop to hollow out democracy.